Good evening and good afternoon. Welcome everyone to the special program on faith, Catholic Church, society and culture. My name is Piotr Bednarski. I'm based in Poland, near Warsaw. Our interview today will be with His Eminence George Cardinal Pell, prominent prelate of Catholic Church. We are very privileged to have you with us. And Your Eminence, let me express our warm welcome and thanks for agreeing to participate in this event. Before we start...
Yes, good, Peter. Have you lost me?
Go ahead.
Before we start, we should pray. Is that correct?
Yeah, in a moment. We should pray in a moment, but I need to make a few organizational announcements. This program is organized by lay Catholics from Poland and Switzerland, EWTN Poland, publisher of Polish translation of your prison journal, Rafael Publishing House, and we are supported in this program by Zbigniew Przybyłowski, my co-host, Łukasz, Mirosław, and Jerzy Mycka, who are in the back office supporting us with questions, and Łukasz Chmielowski, who is in charge of IT. This meeting will last 90 minutes, and the participants will have chance to ask questions via chat box. We'll try to select some of the questions. I cannot promise all of them will be asked. Sure. Many questions are already there.
Yes, I've lost the view.
Yeah. We want to start with the Lord's Prayer in Latin because this is the tradition of our meeting, and I would like to ask Łukasz to put the text of our Father in Latin on the screen. Pater noster, qui es in celis,
sanctificetur
nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra. Panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimite nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimitibus debitoribus nostris, et non nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen. I will pass the floor to my colleague Zbigniew Przybyłowski to start the interview. Zbigniew, the floor is yours.
Your Eminence, let me start with some personal questions about yourself, so that our audience has a chance to know a little bit more about your biography. I understand that your mother was a Catholic, a pious Catholic, but your father was a non-practicing Anglican. And my question is, how then did you become a believing Catholic? Was there a moment of conversion in your life, or were you always a pious person? And who taught you about God? Who transmitted the faith to you?
No, I didn't have a big moment of conversion. My mother perhaps felt a little bit guilty with going into a mixed marriage. Back in 1939, these weren't very common in Australia, although there were many mixed marriages. She was a woman of strong faith. Her family were strongly Catholic. She had a first cousin who was a Dominican priest. Nearly all of them went to Mass. And I received my faith from my mother, and my father was quite accepting of that. So there was, I grew up as a believer, going to Mass, and I'm very grateful for the faith I received from my mother's and her family. And also in those days, the faith was very much strengthened by the schools I went to.
Mm-hmm. And you are a very open person and very eager to converse, to dialogue with various people, even the non-believers, people who are sort of immersed in the contemporary culture. What nourishes that eagerness and that openness and that optimism that we should convert others and that we can do it?
Well, my father was a nominal Anglican, but he was basically tone deaf religiously. He wasn't a religious man at all. and quite a number of my relatives on my father's side were not religious at all. So I grew up with people like that, and obviously I have a sympathy for them, but I think I have some understanding of them and their position. And obviously, I loved my father. He was very good to me, and so I've been heavily involved in ecumenical dialogue and in dialogue with people who have little faith and no faith.
Including Richard Dawkins.
That's right, yes. Well, that was a slightly different encounter, but we might talk about that later, perhaps.
Okay. And then you became a priest and a bishop, an archbishop, a cardinal. And I have a question regarding what is it required? What are the required qualities and gifts for each of these callings? Are they very different? What makes a good or a bad priest, bishop, cardinal?
Well, basically, the answer is the same at all three levels. The first thing you need, of course, is a strong faith. And you need to nourish that by prayer. And you need to regularly serve the people. I always found in Australia that the people were very supportive of their priests, tolerant of our weaknesses, provided they felt we were there. We had their best interests at heart, and that we were working to help them. And in my part of Australia, the faith was planted by the Irish clergy, and they planted well. And they were, like all of us priests, imperfect, but Australia is still a pretty strong church, and we owe an immense debt to especially to the Irish people in my state of Victoria who founded the church. I was particularly inspired by we had a great Catholic Archbishop in Melbourne, Daniel Mannix. He was very outspoken. He was in the tradition of Wyszynski and Baran and Minzenti and all these people. And the Irish Australian people were poor, less educated, and so he was also a great tribal leader, and through the Catholic education produced spectacular social mobility.
And how is it that you became from a priest? How is it that you became a bishop and then an archbishop, a cardinal? What were the events?
Well, they're very different questions. How I became a priest was because I felt that God was asking me to become a priest. I was not very generous as a young man. I didn't particularly want to become a priest at all, but I felt somehow I should become a priest. And I do think that God was calling. Now, when you become a bishop and a cardinal, well, these are miracles of providence, but it's quite different. Those, whether you are promoted, depends a lot on chance, who you come across, on how your work goes. But that's different from the decision to become a priest.
So it seems like you have chosen the difficult path in your life, and you have continued that when you were working in the Vatican, reforming the economy and the finances. And
No, I beg to differ. I never set out to follow any difficult path. I did set out to do my duty, and I am an old-fashioned fellow. I think that the concept of duty and responsibility is equally as important as rights. Sometimes you have to do your duty, even when you realize it might provoke some trouble. that come at some cost or some price. But one of the things I regularly say to people and to young people, cut price Christianity doesn't work very well, and no Christianity is cost-free. We have to use the scriptural imagery, we have to take up our cross. And if we do, God helps us.
Yeah, and so even though you did not set out to undertake these difficult tasks, you still ended up performing them, and you were tasked with something that's quite difficult, that the reform of finances and the economy of Vatican. And you mentioned in one of the interviews that you should have fought harder to keep your external auditor, PwC, and the internal auditor when they were fired. Why is it so difficult to do this job of cleaning the economy and the finances in Vatican? And what did you specifically mean by that comment that you should have fought harder?
Well, they are very good. They are very good questions. It wouldn't have made any difference if I had fought harder, but you wonder whether it might marginally have made a difference if you'd played your cards better, or perhaps whether you should have resigned. But on the balance, I don't think that would have helped at all. Now, why patterns of incompetence, patterns of cronyism, working with friends and a primitive methodology, these are exploited by clever and cunning criminals. We hope most of them outside the Vatican, but the Vatican has lost a lot of money over the last 40 years. At least 500 million. That is a lot of money to lose through incompetence and corruption. So we have introduced the methodologies that is used everywhere in the first world. It is much more difficult to steal money from the Vatican now. My successor is an honest and capable man. I think certainly the bank, the IOR, has been cleaned up. I believe we have stopped the money laundering there. So it would be nice to be further ahead, but we have made some progress. And even this scandalous trial, which is occurring in the Vatican now, as Pope Francis said, the fact that these things have come to light is evidence of some level of better performance. What would be even better is if we prevent these scandals from occurring rather than discovering them after they've occurred. But the latter is also an achievement.
Yes, and we are fortunate because we do not know what we have actually prevented, what might have occurred in the future. So this is a good job done there. Let me ask you a slightly different question. You are a vocal defender of the truth of the Magisterium of the Church, although sometimes it costs you harsh criticism from many sides. Why is it that you have the courage and the strength to do that when there are some prelates quite high up in the church that are silent? Why is there this silence?
Well, people have different roles, different priorities. There are different national situations where in some situations it might not be prudent to be as outspoken as you might be in other situations. I was just talking today to somebody about the difference of the Catholic situation under JP2 in Poland and in China. St. John Paul II had massive public support in Poland, but the Catholic presence in China in 1.3 or 1.4 billion people is minuscule. They have very, very little political significance. So that is just a different context. And I think I inherited, my mother is Irish Australian, my father was largely British. Both of these were strong people, and they both taught me that if you had something to say, you should say it, and you should not refrain from saying it simply out of cowardice or fear. And also that was instilled into us by our teachers, by the Christian brothers, the Irish Australian Christian brothers. And I'm very grateful for those examples. I might occasionally have said too much, but that is better than never saying anything.
And so you were standing up against error inside of the church. And let me ask you this: where does the error in the hierarchy of the church, where does the error come from there? Is it because people are malformed in the homes, in the family, in the schools? Is it in the seminaries? Is it corruption later on when they're coming out of the seminary and are confronting the secular world?
No, I think every personal story is different. We believe in original sin. Every one of us in our hearts has to battle against evil, against our selfishness, our desire for comfort and self-aggrandizement. The world, the flesh, and the devil are real. St. Ignatius of Loyola spoke about the two standards, about the battle between right and wrong. This is not just when armies clash in a place like Ukraine, but there's a constant struggle between good and evil in every society, in every family, and in every heart. And goodness comes in different forms, and so does evil.
And so you're saying it's an individual question there. You do not notice any clear patterns of where the evil comes from on a grand scale inside of the church.
Well, once again, that's a pretty leading and difficult question, and I suppose the answer would be different in each diocese, each religious order, and each nation. We all have strengths and weaknesses. In Australia, our weakness, our temptation is to think we can have the good life without God. There is an instinct for agnosticism in Australia. Now, in the past, at any rate, I remember a good Catholic writer said the Australian temptation is to trivialize Christ and not to persecute him. Now, I think that might be changing a little bit. The tensions in Australia used to be between Protestants and Catholics, between English and Irish, but the Protestants were strong Christians. Nowadays, of course, the significant tension is between the Judeo-Christian point of view and those who are aggressively secularist.
And you are absolutely right. This is sort of a leading question because I wanted to sort of go to the point of, there's been a couple of big events in the last 50, 60 years in the history of the church, the revolution, sexual revolution of the 60s. And then some people are saying that some of the problems are starting with or around the time of the Second Vatican Council. And so my question was leading towards the fact, where are the bad priests coming from? Are they non-believers in the first place, who sort of were not detected in the process of allowing them to become priests? Or are these people who were corrupted by the society? And that I mean in terms and in connection with the sexual scandals, and that's why I'm mentioning the sexual revolution of the 60s.
Yes, well, once again, that's a very difficult question to answer. It can be. But it's often impossible to enter into the hearts of people and to see what drives them. Now, I have heard in what were the communist countries, perhaps in Russia today, where the communists introduced to people, I certainly have heard of it in China, into the seminaries, who were explicitly agents, atheist agents of communism. Now, I don't think we had anything comparable to that in Australia. I do think the Second Vatican Council came, I think, at one of the worst possible times for a church council, because it coincided with the invention of the contraceptive pill. And that just didn't diminish the number of children. It, in a certain sense, it liberated, changed the nature of sexual activity from a sacred familial activity to a sort of a recreational rite. And then this hedonism was spread widely by groups like the Rolling Stones and the Beatles. It was a genuine cultural revolution. And then we had the 68 uprising in Paris and the continued dominance of the 68. And it now emerges in France that many of those, were open and explicit advocates for pedophilia, for pedophilial activity. So the moral confusion from the sexual revolution probably increased the temptations and the difficulties in the 60s and the 70s. Now, it was a time of the prophets of doom, who were so castigated at the start of the council, perhaps for different reasons, were massively vindicated.
Yes.
At least in the first world, because I'm trying to find out how many priests left the priesthood. Some people around the world, some people said 100,000 did. Now, I suspect I have that is in my notes. I looked at some other notes and said 30,000, but I suspect the number is between that. To some extent, providentially, the church behind the Iron Curtain was saved some of the worst confusion that followed the council in the Western world, simply because you had another great struggles to confront, and that was to just hang on to the faith in the face of so much anti-Catholic government pressure.
Cardinal Pell, let me switch to another theme which was so important, also expressed in your prison journal, sex abuse scandal in church and your challenge. When I read your biography by Tess Livingston, I was so impressed that Australia Church and especially the Diocese of Melbourne under your direction was the first to introduce already in 1996 Melbourne Protocol and Program Towards Healing, which was one of the first pioneering program to help those who are victims of clerical sex abuse. And it costs you a lot of time and pain and also effort. And could you tell us what was the root causes of sex abuse in church and in society, and why is it so difficult to stop it? What are the key lessons from Australia, and whether the sex abuse scandals are somewhat related to homosexuality of priests, which might be suggested by John Jay report issued in US? Any thoughts on that?
Yes, I have plenty of thoughts on that. Whenever you have regular interaction between adults and young people, you have a potential for trouble and for sin. That will never change. So I don't think this problem will ever be completely abolished. But one advantage we have now is that we talk about it. Society is warned. Children are warned. It is on the radar. Until at least the late 80s in Australia, there was a great silence about sexual abuse in institutions. Interestingly, in Australia, at this moment, there is a similar silence about the sexual abuse of minors outside institutions, in families, in rural communities in Australia. Outside, people still don't particularly want to talk about that. There are still some areas that are taboo. Very, very few Catholic priests are technically pedophiles or pederasts, because probably 80% of the misdemeanors, the crimes, were with 14-year-old boys and older. So the statistics are almost unanimous, at least in the English-speaking world, that the Catholic victims are largely boys. There is something of a different pattern in the Protestant churches, where there is there's not such a high percentage of male victims. So we've made good progress. You have to face up to the problem, provide justice for those who have been hurt. We offered free counselling for those who have been wounded. I think in the past we didn't understand the damage that was done spiritually and psychologically to the victim. I think we underestimated the force of habit. I don't know whether that's the psychologically correct word, but the inability of people who are deeply pedophilic to change their behavior. A lot of bishops got into trouble because they worked and cooperated with psychologists who thought they could cure the great majority of these people. And in so many cases, that was proved to be untrue. So we offered monetary compensation. We put together the Melbourne response and towards healing with the cooperation of the police, with the cooperation of the government. And although we were criticized later by a later generation of police, I was Archbishop of Melbourne for 5 years. And when I left Melbourne in 2001, quite a number of people in public life said to me privately, well, one thing you did well when you were in Melbourne was to start the Melbourne response and to confront this problem. I think in our 5 years in Melbourne, we helped something like 300 people. Now, the figure might be approximate, but a lot of good work was done, was imperfect, but it was often not sufficiently recognized later.
Mm-hmm. Looking at the global church, what should be done better, what should be continued, and what should be discontinued in the approach to clerical sex abuse? Any general guidance for the church stemming from your own experience? Would you add to what you said already?
Well, I can't add a great deal, but I do know the situation is enormously different in different countries. In some countries, still, it is very difficult for victims to be believed. The pendulum has swung too far in our country now, and so people are often judged to be guilty simply because they are accused. And I think the statistics they have shown this, both certainly in England, very famous case involving senior political figures, was shown to be a complete lie. There are a significant number of false accusations, and this is not entirely surprising. People are wounded, often by drugs, alcohol, years of suffering. Their memories are imperfect, and they imagine all sorts of things. Sometimes, of course, I think they might be tempted to tell lies simply for financial gain, for the recompenses that they receive. Now, I don't want to overemphasize the percentage of false accusations, but they do exist, and it is not a mark of a civilized society that people are judged to be guilty simply because they are accused.
In that respect, you also became a victim of false accusation. And let me ask you directly, do you think that this accusation, which came twice, because once in Melbourne you were accused of cover up of the pedophile priest, and then yourself as you were accused of committing sex abuse acts, do you think that this kind of false accusations are somewhat related to looking for scapegoat, or more perhaps related to your bold teaching and defense of Catholic morals and your being outspoken on a number of social ethical issues which got nervous some part of the political spectrum in Australia? And in hindsight, do you understand why God's providence led you through such painful experience of prison?
No, I believe very strongly in God's providence, but I regularly don't know what God is up to. But if I hadn't been in jail and been falsely accused and written my my prison journal, I would never be on the television tonight speaking to you people. And one of my consolations is that a number of people, many people from different parts of the world, have told me they have been helped by my prison journals. And another thing that embarrasses me, makes me feel very humble, is I've been in quite a few countries in the world since, and so many people come up to me and tell me that they were praying for me. I met 3 Polish priests today. a little while ago, I was a person from Slovakia came up to me and said they'd been praying for me. People in Vietnam, not to mention then, of course, the whole Anglophone world. I received 4,000 letters from many of them from very out of the way places from an Australian point of view. So God brings good things out of suffering. And I think one of the great advantages of the Christian way of life, the Christian teaching, is to tell people that our suffering can be redemptive. If you don't believe in God, if you don't believe that Jesus Christ saved us by his death and resurrection, then suffering has no meaning. It's just a brute fact. It might warn you that you're sick, but beyond that, in many cases, it has no possible redemptive value at all outside of God. So I think everybody has a measure of suffering. We hope they don't have too much suffering. But I think we Christians have an enormous advantage because we can explain to the young people, yes, once in a while you might suffer. We hope you won't suffer too much. But when you suffer, you can offer up your suffering united to Christ's and ask him to use it for some good purpose. And we believe that that can be done. That's a great consolation.
Your Eminence, the Lord is moving in mysterious ways, and he has elevated you to a very high position in the church and in today's world, only to put you to this trial. And you spent 404 days in prison. In an interview, you said that you were kept in balance by regular prayer, reading your books, physical exercise, good sleep, and so on and so on. And I am thinking that, being so high in the world and being put to such a tremendous trial, you must have some reflections on this. And in hindsight, what are the most difficult moments and what are the most edifying moments of that time?
Perhaps the most edifying moments were the loyalty of my family and my friends and the people who prayed for me and publicly supported me. Quite a number of people in Australia have consistently and publicly supported me and have paid a price for it. I think of one Jesuit priest whom I had disagreed with on theological matters, but perhaps I still would. But he was, he comes from a high legal family. He's got a very good understanding of the law, and he was quite outraged. But, for example, one magazine he had written for a Catholic magazine for many years, because of his support for me, I think the other writers in the magazine said that if he continues, they would stop. So people have told me they have lost friends because they defended me. That all those things are beautiful and remind one of the strength of the Catholic faith and how grateful we must be for our faith and our friends and for their courage. What was the most difficult thing? The suffering of my family, the suffering of my friends, the damage that my conviction did to the reputation of the church. And then there were personal indignities, not many, in jail. For example, I always found the strip searches to be, well, they're designed to be humiliating as well as to maintain discipline. in the jail. But I've got no complaints. Basically, I mean, the warders differed one from the other. Some were more or less sympathetic, but by and large, I was well treated. And my criminal friends in jail told me that the jails in my state of Victoria were the best jails in Australia. So that's a tribute to the state, that they are. It's not to the Hotel Hilton, but I think one of the ways you can judge a society is to see not only how it treats its poorest people, but how it treats its prisoners.
It sounds really precious when you say my criminal friends.
Yeah.
Let me just maybe ask one additional question on that subject, because when you were alone in prison, separated from the world, from your loved ones, without contact with your lawyers for some time because of your influenza, you were left in the darkness by yourself. Where does a man find strength? What do we have to do when such a dark hour comes on us?
Oh, well, we pray. And I remember thinking that. I had often said to young people, if you don't pray when you are in trouble, then your faith is weak indeed. And every now and again I felt slightly embarrassed, am I only praying to God because when I'm in trouble? But I had no embarrassment in doing so. And so undoubtedly the greatest source of strength for me in prison came from my faith. The vow I was able to pray. I was encouraged by the letters I received. I was encouraged by the visitors that I received, the loyalty of my friends. Both the Archbishop of Sydney and the Archbishop of Melbourne came to see me. The former Prime Minister of Australia came down to see me. A couple of people I had worked with in the financial world in the Vatican flew out from Europe to visit me in jail. I was immensely heartened by the support I gave. A couple of the people I know a bit about are Thomas More and John Fisher at the time of the English Reformation, both killed by Henry VIII. Now, what was radically different, well, there were many differences, but no one in family supported him. No one believed that he wasn't exaggerating the evil. John Fisher was the only bishop who stood against Henry VIII as the head of the church in England. Fisher had studied the problem of the papacy. I think he probably convinced More that the role of the successor of Peter is not a wonderful sociological example of historical evolution, eminently useful, but is rooted in the mind of Christ and is in the divine plan for the church. That's why they both stood firm. But they were alone. Now, I wasn't alone. Psychologically, spiritually, morally, and that was a great help and consolation to me.
Just one question that came to my mind right now. You were receiving many letters from Catholics, pious people who were advising to offer your suffering to the Lord. And in your memoir, you are writing about it with great humility. And I always feel in such situations that it's a dangerous thing to propose to the person who is suffering, who's going through that suffering, such practices, because people who are outside don't know what it is. Was it something difficult for you, or was it a natural thing to listen to this these advices, because you displayed a tremendous humility describing these letters.
Oh, well, I don't know whether humility is the right word. Realism, perhaps. Well, I mean, if you take the teachings of Christ seriously, certain things follow. And Christ teaches us to forgive. And I often quote, I remember a marriage encounter, and one married woman, mother and wife, said, when she was furious with her husband, she would decide to forgive him. Just make the decision. And then generally the feelings would follow. And I think I like to tell the story of Lord and Lady Longford. They were converts, I think Irish, but lived in England, and just well-known Catholics. And someone asked Lady Longford, she said, "You've been married for many years to your husband. Did you ever think of divorce?" She said, "Never, but I often thought of killing him."
Okay. Okay. Well, let me ask you a different question then. When you found yourself in these difficulties, you were not supported financially by the church, so the church did not help to pay for your defense, and your defense was sponsored by donors. And I am thinking, what is your opinion about this situation? Because we see a number of cases where priests are most likely, or for sure, accused falsely, and they are left to their own devices. Do you believe that the church should have, or does it have, an effective mechanism of supporting the shepherds, the priests?
Now, it's an important question. A preliminary distinction is that the members of religious orders, the religious order pays for their defense. For those of us who are diocesan priests, we don't have a vow of poverty, so we have to find their own money. But such a person should never be left alone. They should certainly be supported. And as a bishop, I tried to do that. We've got to tread a very delicate line. We must not appear to be only supporting the persons who are accused. We've got to provide support to the complainants, many of whom will be victims. And I think what happens, at least in Australia, is that the priest friends and the family and other friends of the priest who are accused will generally support him and stand with him. And also many priests in Australia, it's a prosperous society, do have some amount of money themselves, as I did, and which I committed to the defence. But so it's certainly a difficult problem. But I think the regulations we have in Australia, while they are imperfect, are as good as we can get them at the moment. I don't know about the financial. I mean, in a society where the priests in the parishes have got very, very little money at all, obviously they have much less capacity to defend themselves. They shouldn't be left alone. And everybody has a right to due process in the law. And we believe strongly that a person is innocent until they are found guilty.
Mm-hmm. And that brings us to the next question, which is your trial has, in your appeals process, has proven that you were tried by biased courts. that due process was not upheld. The question that comes to our mind is what has happened? What has happened in Australia, which is part of the Anglosphere, where we, thought and believed that the legal system is effective and is protecting the innocent. What happened there that such a case is possible, that one of the most prominent sons of the nation is being treated in such an unfair way, thrown to jail based on accusations which are not supported by evidence? How did it come to this situation?
Well, a preliminary point, in a technical sense, there was due process. It was just that the jury, the first jury could not come to a decision. The second jury met for 5 days, and obviously those who thought that I was not guilty finally collapsed. What was more remarkable was that the two most senior judges in the state of Victoria upheld the decision of the jury. Now, that was a remarkable decision. One of the interesting things about my situation is the number of people without any religious faith at all who publicly supported me. Australia is a wonderful country, but often not too much happens there, apart from the Test cricket against England and India and Pakistan and the rugby and things like that. And one of the more interesting elements in Australian society is the Catholic Church. And there is a significant tension between the old social conservatives and the new wave, which I think is producing chaos. So the pornographers, the people who are militantly homosexuals, the LGBT people, they are often very, very strongly opposed to Catholics and Christians, especially social conservatives. So, and also we had a government committee of inquiry. We had terrible scandals in the pedophilia, and also we had other scandals. In some cases, the bishops dealt with it very, very badly indeed. Now, public opinion was genuinely outraged by that, and that was exploited by the enemies of the church. So there was a massive feeling against the church. And after I was found guilty, my friends told me that in the court afterwards, quite a number of people said, yes, he mightn't be guilty, but it's a good thing that somebody in the church was punished, because the church deserved to suffer, so that there was an element in which I was the scapegoat.
Is there still an order of the law in Australia when an innocent person, an individual, is punished for perceived errors of a group of people? Is the country now run by anti-Christian, anti-Catholic ideologues?
No. I think probably the state of Victoria, the tensions between the secularists and the social conservatives are possibly stronger there. No, but the rule of law generally in Australia still remains strong. In every system of law, mistakes are made, and they are, I don't believe they are made systematically and regularly. In one of the areas, though, where that might be occurring is in Australia, because the law has been changed to protect those who complain of pedophilia. So, for example, let me give you one example. The defensive, my defense, was not able to access the medical records of my accuser to see whether he'd had psychological troubles or troubles with drugs, which in fact he had. And the jury were not even, you could not tell the jury that we had asked for that information and that we were forbidden from obtaining it. Now, these are small details in the legislation, and I think eventually the pendulum will swing back a bit. But no, the entire Australian judicial system should not be condemned. And I would remind you that the High Court, the highest court in the land, ruled 7-0 in my favour. I remember the young reporter announcing it, and first of all, he couldn't believe that I'd been found innocent, declared not guilty by the court. And then he nearly fell over when the word came through that the judges had voted 7-0. A lot of people were quite happy to believe the worst of the Catholic Church. Because if you're teaching about sexual standards and then it is proved that those who are preaching are not following them, that is a good, juicy scandal, and a lot of people take pleasure in that.
Let me move to another area which you already alluded to, which is the Christian approach to suffering. How to persuade contemporary young Christian or non-believers that our sufferings can be used for some good, uniting us with Christ, and that might that awareness of the meaning of the suffering can change a lot in our life. I know that, for example, Jordan Peterson, a Canadian psychologist, he somewhat speaks about that, about the suffering as a way to accepted suffering as a way to become better man. Could you share your insights into that?
Well, I think we need to talk about it. We need to just explain what Jesus taught about suffering. Now, to some extent, that is reflected in pagan wisdom. No pain, no gain. People understand that. And I've got no new revelations as a result of being in jail, but I have felt able to say to people, I'm more convinced than ever that the Christian mix works, that what Christ told us is true. There's no escaping suffering. We have to wrestle with it, either say it's meaningless or some good or some significance can be found in it. And of course, if we never encounter difficulties, there is very little development. If children are spoilt, not disciplined, given too many advantages, shielded from every challenge, that is no protection for life as an adult. And I used to say to the young people, if anybody presents to you a religion that doesn't require some sort of sacrifice, that is cost-free, it's not a genuine religion at all. Achievement comes at a price. Every achievement, good marriage, good family. Look at the hours of training that a great pianist or a musician or a painter or our athletes do to achieve that high level of performance. We simply need to tell people that. Sometimes people aren't ready to receive it. Okay. And also I used to say to the young people, have a look around at the adults that you admire and see what principles they have that has sustained them in their life. But we have to talk about our beliefs. And then what is even harder, though, is to, however imperfectly, to live them, so that people can say, "Yeah, well, he's imperfect, but at least he's trying to be sincerely faithful to his principles." Or her.
One of the illustration of this suffering is persecution of Christians. Christians are, according to many reports, considered one of the most persecuted group globally. And we see this kind of diminishing religious freedom and freedom of conscience also in the Western, in first world, not to say China and other countries. And do we see, recently there was imprisonment of Cardinal Zen in Hong Kong. He was released on bail later on. Do you see a new wave of persecution of Christians? Are the words of late Cardinal George of Chicago that I will die in the bed, but my successor might die in prison, are going to materialize? And in that context, one additional question: how we would interpret this secret deal between Vatican and China, when we know that in China, after this deal, the persecution even increased? We in this part of Europe don't understand that, because we've got in our minds the diplomacy of Vatican in the 70s in Poland, when so-called Ostpolitik really was a subject of manipulation by communists. Could you comment on these two elements?
Well, we have, first of all, I would like to say we are different from China in the democracies. The Chinese people cannot fight and organize and put up candidates and conduct their propaganda and try to convince people to vote in the elections for views that are compatible with Christianity. So now before I will talk about the China, but before we get to that, that's one of the differences I have with Rod Dreher's Benedict option. We must not withdraw from the public square. We must realize the advantages of living in a free, democratic society where we still enjoy basic free speech. And Christians must, I believe, organize politically to defend our rights. Not only do we have the freedom to do that, I think we have the obligation to do that. Now, in terms of China, I would presume that the Vatican efforts are well-intentioned. They're trying to get a bit more freedom and peace for their Catholics. Now, I don't know the situation in every part of China. I do suspect, I've been told, I've been there 3 times myself, but that was 30 years ago, just after Tiananmen Square. The situation religiously varies enormously, but in some places at least, it seems to have got worse. Now, I think if you make an agreement and you get nothing out of it, and in fact things would seem to be going worse, then there's got to be some good reason for the treaty to continue. And if no benefit is coming from it, well, we put it to one side. But I do want to explicitly pay tribute to the faithful Catholics who have remained loyal to the papacy since Mao Zedong came to power, I think in the late 40s. They have remained faithful in all that time and their heroism and their loyalty. I pay tribute to it, and I acknowledge their contribution and their heroism. And I'm so distressed that they have to suffer. I know Cardinal Zen. I admire him greatly. I've learned about Jimmy Lai, the man, the tycoon, great fighter for freedom, who's decided to remain in Hong Kong when he could have fled and is now in jail. These men are genuinely fine men. They're genuine heroes, and I support them.
Yeah, I mean, in that area also we see persecution from outside. But you mentioned once that the true danger for the church is when she will be transformed by secular hedonistic culture and departs from apostolic tradition. And we see this kind of trend when in certain former Christian countries, even leading prelates promote unorthodox teaching contrary to gospel, especially on human sexuality, human anthropology. You take on that. What shall lay people do in that situation when you see this penetration of hedonistic culture? We open to this culture.
Well, I think very charitably, very quietly, the people should tell those prelates, I don't agree. What you are saying is contrary to the teaching of the New Testament. It's contrary to the teaching, explicit teaching of St. Paul. It is contrary to what Christ believed and taught, because Paul would never have taught anything that he thought Christ did not teach. There's an almost unanimous tradition over 2,000 years on the matter of on the basic issues of Christian sexual morality. So I think people should politely, charitably tell these bishops they are praying for them, and point out we are not masters of the apostolic tradition. No one, the Pope down to the youngest Catholic, no one has a right to change, diminish the apostolic tradition. We can study it, try to penetrate more deeply. There is development within the tradition, but we are the servants and the defenders of the apostolic tradition, and the unity of the universal church must be built around that apostolic tradition. And also, we can't take the unity of the Catholic Church for granted. It is a marvelous, wonderful achievement. It's precious. We've only got to look at the Anglican communion around the world, the different national orthodox churches, to see the alternatives. And the Catholic unity is not a loose federalism where some national churches can deny elements of the apostolic tradition and just be left in peace. That's not the Catholic tradition.
What's your reading of the current trend in the West, abandoning the objective truth in politics, in academia, especially in education, dictatorship of relativism? Do you think that the next phase of this trend in the society, some of the analysts call them neo-Marxism or some kind of new form of communism? Do you think that we might end up with imprisonments of people who because of the conscience or because of the beliefs might be challenged at the workplace, might be put to jail because of hate speech? Do you see any kind of developments in these trends? We see that in the West. And the second question, many of priests and nuns are today confronted both in real terms and in social media with hatred. What can we advise them? How they should face this kind of wave of hate?
Well, I don't think we should exaggerate it. is not all gloom. There are a lot of good Catholics, good Christians, and often good secular people who are devoted to the defense of human rights and to free speech. Once again, the situation is different in different countries. We don't know what the way things will turn out. A lot of it will depend on how effective we are politically in defending our religious freedom. And I think that certainly should not be led by the bishops, but the bishops should certainly encourage Christian social conservatives to be politically active to defend religious freedom. Now, we might not be entirely successful. Things might go from bad to worse, but life is full of surprises. Very few people predicted the collapse of communism in Europe, Eastern Europe, and Russia, and it collapsed without violence. One of the things that we have to point out is that the alternative to the Judeo-Christian teachings in the Western world is not another less perfect, coherent form of paganism. It is chaos. The alternatives are wrecking society, destroying families, destroying young people without men in their families, drugs, alcohol, divorce, pornography. Significant numbers of young adults, because of pornography, no longer interested in actual physical sexual activity. This is going to be a great problem, not just for church people. And when people, Christianity spread in the pagan Roman Empire, which was much worse than ours, much more unequal, much more violent, much more anarchic in a sexual sense. Christianity spread precisely because people saw the advantages of Christian living that Christianity brought, and especially the liberation of women. And monogamy is probably still the best, one of the best defenses for the dignity of women. St. Augustine said, I think it was something like, God invented marriage so that men would be interested in their children. And I think I probably slightly misquoted him there, but that was the general direction. So all is not gloom. We've got enormous strengths, and we have to struggle and be aware of our strengths and tell the young people of the advantages, human advantages, as well as the promise of life after death from following Christ.
Eminence, as we observe the unfolding of the Germinal Synodal Way, which is departing from the fundamental teaching of the Church, we learn that you are a supporter of the Fraternal Open Letter of Correction sent by over 80 bishops to Germany. Why do we not see the admonishment of the Holy See of these actions?
Well, I think there are well over 100 bishops who have signed this particular letter. And then there is, of course, the position of the Polish bishops and the Scandinavian, the Nordic bishops. So there is a very significant opposition to it. And I think I think the Holy Father will speak. It will be one of the things that will have to be done. And I think we need to say, Holy Father, you will have our support when you do exercise a right and proper discipline, and say that this explicit this rejection of Christian sexual teaching is not appropriate, is quite wrong. It's a new development, because previously people would nod and insinuate and go very close to infringing on what was the doctrine, and people who were hostile would think they knew what was being meant. But these are very explicit, they are inexperienced heretics. They have, to explicitly deny the basics of Christian sexual teaching, to ignore the fact that this is divinely revealed, that it's part of the apostolic tradition, to deny it because it is thought to be against some contemporary understandings. This is, I think, very counterproductive, and it will add to human suffering, and it will not slow down the exodus from the church. It will increase it.
And do you believe that this lack of intervention of the Holy See is sort of leading to a Protestantization, if you will, of the Catholic Church, and of the undermining of the teaching authority of Rome and the doctrinal unity of the Church and the role?
The classical Protestants believe very much in the Christian teaching on sexuality, so that whatever is happening, it is not the Protestantization, a radical liberalism, a radical adaptation of the understandings of the modern world. So we have two alternatives. The church is in decline in many parts of the Western world. Lower levels of practice, people leaving. Now, some people say, well, we will stop them leaving if we become more pagan. But in fact, the evidence is already in. We see very clearly that this empties the church faster than ever. The liberal Protestant churches, in many cases, have almost disappeared. Liberal Catholicism in Belgium and Holland is a shadow of what it was. So it is in Quebec, and so it will be in Germany if people follow this neo-paganism in the vain hope of reducing the exodus from the church.
Okay, but it does lead in a certain way to a decentralization of the church, a concept that I believe that Cardinal Martini was promoting in the past, does it not?
Well, I mean, that undoubtedly, we don't know where this synodal way is going. This document on synodality doesn't explain that. But what is one of the ironies of the situation, of course, is that we have a pope who very much believes in the papal right to intervene anywhere in the world. And we have probably not had such an interventionist pope for not just decades, possibly hundreds of years. So it is the complete opposite of local freedoms.
And so how do you see the trajectory of this? Because you say the Pope did not utter where this road is leading. How do you see where it is going? Because we are looking at it and we are puzzled. And sometimes it can lead to two different dioceses on two sides of a river having completely different moral teaching or even doctrinal teaching. Where do you see that this is taking us?
Well, I mean history is full of differences amongst Christians and Catholics. But the Catholic Church, the unity is built on the figure of Christ, and the successor of Peter is the guarantor of the doctrinal unity around the apostolic tradition, which is expressed in the creeds and the councils. We are not united by agreeing to disagree on fundamental central points. That is not a Catholic option.
Mm-hmm. And so we are having a difficulty understanding where this is supposed to take us. We see that there are people invited to participate in this process that are clear dissidents from the faith and the church. Some of them are open enemies of the church. And we as lay people are puzzled about the sort of purpose of this. And we are wondering what our position should be, what actions should we take. Would you have any words of advice of how we as lay people should act in this situation?
Well, I suppose it is well-intentioned. They want to hear from people who are no longer members of the church about why they left. The wisdom of their presence is something that could be debated. But what I think we can say very explicitly is that this is a meeting of the Catholic Church. Fortunately, we cannot say that the teachings of the Catholic Church are put into suspension while we discuss them. The Catholic doctrines of faith and morals remain as an essential framework. Now, some people might say, well, we disagree with that, and they have a right to free speech, but they have no right to change basic Catholic doctrines or to suggest that somehow they are in limbo for the duration of this discussion. It is a Catholic gathering under the Pope and under the bishops. And the Pope and the bishops have a divine authority to teach, not to be the best theologians. Many of us as bishops are not great theologians, but we are guarantors of the apostolic tradition. From St. Irenaeus towards the end of the 2nd century, he said, the same doctrine is taught in France, Gallia, and in Germany, and in Italy, and in Spain, and in North Africa. And that is our boast today on the core Christian teachings. And the ancient people wanted to know that they were being taught what Christ taught and what the apostles taught. And so often they went back to the churches founded by the apostles, and especially to the Church of Rome. Rome would give the final tick on what was genuine doctrine, what cohered with the teachings of Jesus, and that's the first and most important criteria.
Your Eminence, I must ask a question about the Benedict way. We are living in a world that is hostile to Christians, to Catholics, and we as parents are seeing our children, finding themselves in a situation where they need to choose whether they want to follow the path of career or remain faithful to their religion. And in this famous book, Rod Dreher has written about St. Benedict's path and how we should isolate ourselves from the world. Would you share your opinion about this concept, and what is your attitude to that?
I think it's a very interesting and stimulating book. I reviewed it, but as time, and I didn't like its central thesis. I think it is a little bit of German elitism, but increasingly I have come to see that we must not vacate the public square. We must stay in public life and discussion and struggle to protect our religious freedoms. Because if everything goes against us, only a minority will be heroes. And I'm very much in favor of ordinary weak people like myself that can be carried along a bit by the correct sociological traditions. Now, the great counter-argument to this defeatism, this flight from the world, is, I think, the coming decision of the Supreme Court in the United States, which will overturn Roe versus Wade. Now, they've been able to do that because of 50 years of struggle by the pro-life forces, which has convinced majority opinion in the United States that most abortion is wrong. They don't believe that abortion is always wrong, but this is an example of the sort of public struggle that we need to engage in. So I can see in Australia and other countries, which I know a bit, we will have to struggle to so that in our Catholic schools we can continue to teach the Christian religion and still receive government funding. We will have to struggle to so that our Catholic hospitals are not forced to perform abortions or practice euthanasia or our retirement homes. We will have to struggle to defend these rights, and I think we should. And I think that with effective leadership and persistence, that we have the capacity to politically defend these freedoms. That's what democracy means. Now, the Irish Australian Archbishop, I quoted Mannix, who came to Australia. He took over in about 1913, I think, and he died in 63. But he said Christians must not forget the radical change in their situation that democracy brings. It brings us the possibility of action to defend our beliefs, which you don't have in times of dictatorship. You don't have in a place like China. Now, our freedoms might be radically curtailed, but we should certainly struggle to retain those freedoms.
I think we are slowly coming towards the close of our time. I would like to ask you two questions. One is the one that is very burning and current issue for us here in the eastern part of Europe, and that is the war in Ukraine. Could you provide a little bit of your reflection on the situation that we are seeing, on how should we treat this war? It's clearly a war of aggression of one state against the other. And some messages that we are receiving are not as clear as we would think or sometimes even hope them to be.
Well, every war is a disaster. What is new, of course, is that now through our televisions, we can see the extent of the devastation and destruction. I mean, it's the most obscene rhetoric to suggest that the country has been liberated from the Nazis when the residential areas of the people who you are supposedly liberating are being systematically destroyed. I believe I have examined the position of Christian pacifism. I understand it, but that is not my position. I believe in a just war. I think it's very difficult to wage war justly, but in this case, we have a classic example of aggression. And so my heart goes out to all the victims in the Ukraine, to the many people, to the millions. I think you've got 3 million refugees in Poland. And I think the Polish community and the Polish church has done marvelous work, I believe, with these refugees, and that will be to your everlasting credit. And I'd like to express a personal word of sympathy and support to the Greek Catholics, to all the Catholics in Ukraine. I wrote to Archbishop Shevchuk in the early days just to give him my support and promise that my poor prayers and support for him and his people. And I received a beautiful letter of thanks for him. So I think it was important for Putin to be stopped. I think he has been stopped because if it was just a pause, my fear was that he would catch his breath and then come again. It hasn't gone the way they had hoped, and I think that is good for freedom and democracy. And please God, the killing will not go on for too much longer. I am not in favor simply of a ceasefire. I am in favor of peace and justice, a ceasefire and justice. And we will just see where things finish up.
Mm-hmm. And Your Eminence, may we ask for, well, first, I would like to thank you very cordially for the time that you have taken to speak to us and share your wisdom with us. And may we ask for some last words to our audience in Poland and in other countries where people are listening to us, but especially here in Poland, in the time of uncertainty associated with the war and with the dangers that are brought with that, but also considering the fact that we as a country, and not only us, but also Hungary, for instance, are under increasing pressure to secularize, to introduce sexual revolution, to obey to the guidance that we receive in Brussels. So for these difficult times of uncertainty and coming spiritual struggle, we ask you for some final words.
Well, I mean, I was tempted to say stick to your guns, but that's not an appropriate metaphor for Christians. But I would make one preliminary point. I think it is very important to try to dialogue even with those who are bitterly opposed to us. If the divisions in society in a democracy become so bitter, so deep that people hate one another, they refuse to talk to one another, that is a failure of democracy. So we have to continue to talk across our differences. That means that we believe in truth. In the English-speaking world, we've got these woke people who don't believe in truth. They believe in my truth, his truth, her truth, somebody else's truth. And so they have no reason to argue or to dialogue. Just whatever version of truth can apply power most successfully triumphs. That's not our approach. We believe in truth. We believe in reason. We believe in dialogue. And I think we should point out to people, don't just examine what we're doing. Don't just examine the costs, the hard teachings of Christianity. See the everyday consequences of the alternative vision of life and the wreckage that it produces, the havoc that it produces in broken families and children who feel that they don't belong, children who've never known a father, taking refuge in drugs and alcohol and pornography. In Australia, we have one of the best societies in the world, very prosperous. We have one of the third or fourth highest male suicide rate in the world. Quite an extraordinary development. I remember I was in Zambia. 40% of the people there had HIV/AIDS. There was no suicide. I came back to Australia with all our blessings, and we've got this high suicide rate. So Christianity is true. Christianity works. We've got to, however imperfectly, try to practice that in our lives and just continue to explain this patiently, charitably. And if people hate us, we must work hard not to hate them, not to return evil for evil. That's what Christ wants.
Thank you
Can
very
I
much.
please ask you for final blessing for our audience, and with deep gratitude for this meeting, we wish you all the best and God's blessing in your mission. And please give us your final blessing. Please.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Zbigniew. May the blessing of Almighty God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit come down upon all of you who are listening. Continue to keep your hearts full of faith and hope and love, and continue to give you the gifts of wisdom, courage, and perseverance. We make this prayer through the same Christ our Lord.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Eminence.
God bless.
God bless you.
God bless you.